In February 1945, the leaders of the free and not-so-free world gathered to plan the future. The location they chose was Yalta, a lovely seaside resort in the Crimea. Or at least it had been lovely before the Nazis used it for target practice. The venue, Levadia Palace, former home of the Tsar, was so riddled with bedbugs that the American delegation had to spray everything with DDT. So there they were, the world's most powerful men deciding the fate of nations while trying desperately not to get bitten by insects. A perfect metaphor, really. Planning a pristine new world order from a bug-infested, bombed-out palace. Nothing says stable, prosperous future like the lingering smell of insecticide and desperation. It was here that the Big Three would sketch out the next 50 years of global anxiety. Let's meet the team. Franklin D. Roosevelt arrived looking less like a president and more like a ghost. He was just months from death, his face gaunt, his blood pressure astronomical. His own doctor noted he had only 6 months to live, a detail conveniently left out of the briefing. Then there was Winston Churchill, perpetually grumpy because he was watching the British Empire dissolve in real time. He was there to save Britain's seat at the adults' table, but he was negotiating with a superpower in decline, holding a handful of expired coupons. And finally, Joseph Stalin, the host. He was the only one who wasn't exhausted. He was energized, paranoid, and had the small home field advantage of the entire Red Army occupying half the continent they were discussing. It wasn't exactly a negotiation between equals. It was two men trying to finish a marathon and a third man waiting at the finish line with a contract and a pen. First on the agenda, Poland, the very country Britain went to war to protect. This should have been straightforward. Everyone agreed Poland should be sovereign, democratic, and friendly. The problem was that for Stalin, friendly meant run by communists I handpicked. He had his own puppet government already set up in Lublin. The West, meanwhile, backed the government in exile in London. So they compromised. Or rather, they agreed on a sentence that sounded like a compromise. They'd form a new government based on the Lublin Group, but with a few other democratic leaders thrown in. It was like ordering a salad and being told it would be based on a bucket of lard with a few lettuce leaves sprinkled on top for balance. They also agreed to free and unfettered elections. Stalin just had a much more creative definition of unfettered than everyone else. Next up, what to do with Germany. Having it start another world war in 20 years was, by general consensus, a bad idea. The solution was to cut it into pieces like a pie. 4 occupation zones, 1 for the Soviets, 1 for the Americans, 1 for the British. Churchill, worried about a power vacuum, insisted France get a slice too. Since no one wanted to give up their own territory, they magnanimously carved the French zone out of the American and British portions. Berlin, inconveniently located deep inside the Soviet zone, was also to be chopped up. What could possibly go wrong with a tiny, divided island of capitalism in the middle of a sea of communism? They also agreed on reparations, with Stalin demanding the modern equivalent of over $200 billion. They agreed in principle, which is diplomatic code for "we'll argue about this later." While everyone focuses on Europe, there was a quiet, almost secret deal about the Pacific War. Roosevelt's top priority was getting the Soviets to attack Japan. His generals told him an invasion could cost up to 1 million American lives. He wanted help. Stalin, a shrewd negotiator, said, sure, for a price. The price was
significant. He wanted control of Manchuria's railways, Port Arthur, and the southern half of Sakhalin Island. These were territories Japan had taken from Russia in 1905. So Roosevelt, without consulting the Chinese, promised Stalin pieces of China in exchange for a declaration of war on Japan. The incredible irony is that just a few months later, the Trinity test would reveal a new weapon that might make a Soviet invasion completely unnecessary. All that horse trading for a problem that was about to be vaporized.
Ah, the United Nations, the great hope for humanity. At Yalta, they hammered out the final details of this new global peace organization. It would have a Security Council, a sort of executive board for the planet. Perfect, except for one tiny feature, the veto. Any of the 5 permanent members, the US, UK, USSR, France, and China, could single-handedly block any substantive resolution. It was a masterpiece of institutionalized hypocrisy. They created a system to enforce international law that came with a built-in get-out-of-jail-free card for themselves. It was like founding a fire department where any of the 5 fire chiefs could cancel the 911 call if their own house was the one on fire. This wasn't a bug, it was the entire point. Global cooperation is great, as long as it never inconveniences you personally.
To make all this cynical map drawing look respectable, they drafted the Declaration on Liberated Europe. It's a beautiful document, full of wonderful phrases like the right of all peoples to choose the form of government under which they will live, and promises to create democratic institutions of their own choice. It's truly inspiring stuff. At the same time this was being signed, Soviet authorities were busy arresting, deporting, or executing non-communist leaders across Eastern Europe. In Romania, the Soviets forced the king to appoint a communist government just weeks after the conference. The declaration wasn't a plan. It was a press release. It was the political equivalent of putting a "World's Best Dad" sticker on a tank. A lovely sentiment that is somewhat undermined by the reality of the machinery it's attached to.
So, why did Roosevelt give Stalin so much? The most generous interpretation is that he was a pragmatist. The Red Army was already there. He couldn't magically wish it away. He believed the only path forward was cooperation, and that required trusting Stalin. He famously told an advisor, "I just have a hunch that Stalin is not that kind of man. I think that if I give him everything I possibly can and ask for nothing from him in return, he won't try to annex anything and will work with me for a world of democracy and peace." Read that again. That was the strategic thinking. It wasn't about leverage, it was about vibes. He genuinely seemed to believe his personal charm could melt the heart of a man who had orchestrated famines and purges. He was playing poker, but thought he was in a trust fall exercise.
Churchill was having a miserable time. He saw exactly what Stalin was doing, but was largely powerless to stop it. He wrote that they were at a disagreeable moment in the history of the world. You can almost feel the Britishness of that understatement. His real fear wasn't just Soviet domination, but American indifference. Roosevelt often positioned himself as a mediator between Churchill the imperialist and Stalin the communist, which drove Churchill mad. America's official stance was anti-colonialism, which meant they weren't exactly enthusiastic about helping Britain hold on to India or its African colonies. So Churchill was fighting a two-front diplomatic war, trying to contain the Soviets in Europe while simultaneously trying to convince the Americans that the British Empire wasn't the actual bad guy here. He was a bulldog, but he was a bulldog on a very short leash held by two much larger owners.
Stalin, meanwhile, played his hand perfectly. He didn't need to shout or make grand demands. He had the ultimate leverage, millions of soldiers sitting on the territory in question. When Churchill and Roosevelt talked about democracy in Poland, Stalin could just point out the window and say, "Fine, make me leave." His strategy was simple. Agree to vague, idealistic principles in writing, then go home and do whatever he wanted anyway. He understood that treaties are only as strong as the armies willing to enforce them. And he knew the war-weary West had absolutely zero appetite for a new war with the Soviet Union. He wasn't a supervillain with a complex plan. He was just a ruthless realist who understood that possession is 9/10 of the law, especially when your version of possession involves several million men with T-34 tanks. The leaders went home and sold Yalta as a triumph of cooperation, a blueprint for peace. The New York Times hailed it as a new dawn for mankind. This new dawn lasted about 3 weeks. That's when Stalin installed the Romanian government I mentioned, making a mockery of the free elections clause. Then came the brutal suppression of any non-communist parties in Poland. Roosevelt, just before his death in April, admitted to an aide, "Averill, I'm beginning to think we've been had." It was a stunning moment of clarity, coming far too late. Yalta wasn't the beginning of post-war peace. It was the moment the battle lines for the next war, the Cold War, were formally drawn on a map. They didn't prevent a conflict, they just gave it a geographic starting point and a set of rules. So, was Yalta a great betrayal, a naive sellout of Eastern Europe? For decades, that was the popular story. But the less exciting truth is that it was probably just an acknowledgement of reality. The Western Allies did not have the military or political will to challenge the Red Army's position in 1945. Starting World War III over the composition of Poland's government was a non-starter. Yalta didn't really give Eastern Europe to Stalin, it just recorded on paper what his army had already taken. It was less a negotiation and more of a dictation. The great tragedy of the conference wasn't what was decided. It was the pretense that any of it was based on shared values or a common vision for the future. They were building a house together, but one side was using blueprints for a democracy, and the other was using blueprints for a prison. And they were both smiling for the cameras the entire time. If you enjoyed this video, please like, comment, and subscribe to our channel for more historical insights. Thanks for watching, nerds!